Looking at our modern economy, it's clear that capitalism has a tremendous capacity for generating wealth. Proponents of capitalism argue that as entrepreneurs risk their capital and generate income, that wealth is then passed down to the rest of the economy, thereby lifting everyone out of poverty. History, however, tells a very different story. Capitalism separates society into two distinct groups, and the power lies squarely in the hands of the owners. It is in their interest to demand as much work as possible and pay as little as possible. In the early days of industrialism, workers had no choice but to accept deplorable conditions, and factory owners exploited the most vulnerable members of society. Today, the sweatshops in Asia and other parts of the world remind us that such exploitation is not a distant memory. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle that many people enjoy today came at a great price. The system was only able to stabilize through the organizing activity of unions and the heavy hand of government, in other words, through socialism. Karl Marx realized that the problem with capitalism was that workers were alienated from the products and the profits of their labor. He observed that the private ownership of capital was the tool used for exploitation. Because workers did not own the factories and tools that they used, they were forced to sell their labor in order to live, an arrangement that is not far off from slavery. Marx's proposed solution, however, did not restore ownership to the worker, but abolished private property altogether. The resulting system offered greater equality, but no incentive for people to work, and no individual stewardship. The Soviet Union and Communist China were able to industrialize rapidly, but over time, productivity declined, and eventually both countries realized that in order to survive, they would have to open up and introduce capitalism into their economies. Looking at capitalism and socialism side by side, we're faced with a dilemma. Capitalism is great at creating wealth, but terrible at distributing it. Socialism distributes wealth, but destroys the engine of wealth creation in the process. The French writer Victor Hugo suggested that the two objectives, wealth creation and wealth distribution, must be solved together to be well solved. The two solutions, he said, must be combined to form only one. Many people today believe that in order to achieve both objectives, we need to mix capitalism and socialism. It seems logical. After all, history has shown that capitalism leads to socialism, and socialism leads to capitalism. The mixed economy is, in fact, the predominant economic model, and countries all over the world practice Keynesianism, also known by the generic term macroeconomics, which holds the belief that governments can and ought to influence the economy through spending and monetary policy. The choice between capitalism and socialism is hardly a choice at all. Both systems concentrate power away from the people, capitalism in the hands of a few individuals, and socialism in the hands of the government. This puts the people in a state of ever-increasing dependence and servitude. Therefore, combining the two objectives is not a matter of mixing the two systems, but creating something entirely new and different. Knowing that the restoration of ownership was the key, Victor Hugo offered a way to resolve the dilemma. Democratize property, he said, not by abolishing it, but by universalizing it in such a way that every citizen, without exception, may be a proprietor. Learn to produce wealth and learn to distribute it, and you shall have material grandeur and moral grandeur combined. He was talking about a third choice, not a capitalist economy in which prosperity trickles down from a few wealthy owners, not a socialist economy in which the government enforces equality and citizens are dependent on the state, but rather an ownership economy in which everyone owns the means of their support, giving them the freedom to enjoy the fruits of their labor and live according to their own values. He was not the first person to suggest this. In fact, before the Communist Manifesto was even written, people such as Thomas Skidmore and George Henry Evans had anticipated the problems that capitalism would create, and they advocated for broad ownership. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, this idea grew in popularity and appeared in various forms. Yet there were significant obstacles to progress. The first problem was that proponents of broad ownership seemed to lack a practical plan describing how this distribution of capital was to take place. Some of the ideas proposed relied on government intervention. Most of these ideas didn't gain much traction. Secondly, the movement was sometimes associated with anti-industrialism and back-to-the-land agrarianism. As technology progressed and more people became comfortable with middle-class living, going back to a simpler life seemed like trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. Many people didn't want to live on a farm or run a small business. They understood that doing so would eliminate the benefits of a fully functioning, modern economy. Eventually, the idea of universal ownership faded from memory until it was all but forgotten. But today, more and more people are starting to recognize that the path we are on is unsustainable. We need to start building an ownership economy. But the challenge remains: how can we bring it about?